YouTube, Sidekick here with a review of the Cessna 195 Businessliner from Carenado. We're here at the Saint-Tropez Airport on the south shore of Montreal, and we've just jumped in the cockpit here. Take a look around. You can see we've got a bench seat back there for 3 passengers, as well as 2 in the front. Got the window open on the left. I think it's about time we get started up. So, first of all, we're just going to get the master switch on here. All the switches are in the center console there, right in front of the pilot. There's the master. Just a simple push down. We're going to turn the beacon light on. And then all we have to do is check our controls here. We want the master, we want the mixture full rich, we want the prop actually to minimum. And then we're just going to take a look around here. I think everything else is ready. So we're going to say clear prop out the window. And then we're going to prime it a couple of times with the throttle. And we're going to give the starter a press. And the engine's going to start. And we're going to move the key to both. And then we're going to put the alternator and the radio master on. And we're going to move the prop to full maximum. And I think we're just about ready to taxi. So today we're going to take the Cessna 195 out for a little spin. We're going to do some flying around Montreal because that's one of the cities that was updated in World Update 11, which was Canada not that long ago. And then we're probably also going to go out west, and we're probably going to do a little flying around Calgary because that's another city that got updated in the latest World Update. Okay, as we get rolling here, though, I want to talk a little bit about how I'm going to do this review, because I've been thinking about it a little. It's taken me a little while to get this review done. Just take a look outside the window there. You can actually stick your head out. I started doing this review, and I just felt like I was saying things about the Cessna 195 that I've said about a lot of airplanes that I have reviewed for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and I started thinking about whether or not there might be a better way of doing reviews for Microsoft Flight Simulator. The challenge, honestly, in reviewing an aircraft for Microsoft Flight Simulator is that there just is a really wide variety of user communities. I mean, there are lots of different people who fly Microsoft Flight Simulator for a lot of different reasons, and they're looking for different things, frankly, in the aircraft that they buy. Some people are very interested in all of the detailed modeling inside and out, but for some people, especially the exterior modeling, might not be that big a deal. Some people are very interested in very in-depth systems modeling, but other people may just be more interested in flying the aircraft. Some people may be very interested in how the aircraft flies, and other people maybe not so much. So I decided that I would basically do a review where I would split my review up into basically 4 categories, basically. And so that's what I'm going to do with the Cessna 195. You guys can tell me what you think. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments about the way I'm going to do this review. And if this works, then I'm going to start reviewing all of the aircraft that I review this way. So the categories that I'm going to review the aircraft based on are, first of all, how does it feel? So how does it look in the cockpit? How does it sound in the cockpit? Does it give you the feeling, a unique experience? Is it different than other aircraft, and if so, how does it distinguish itself? The second category is going to be how does it fly? Not only details of how easy or hard it is to fly, but also is the flying experience unique to the aircraft, and does the flight model seem to make sense based on what we know about the aircraft? The third category that I'm going to talk about is, frankly, what is it good for? What kind of flying would you want to do in this aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator? And this last category is going to be what does it compare to? Like, what other aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator would be similar to this one? And does it add anything to your existing hangar if you already own some of those other aircraft? And then I guess the last thing we'll talk about is if you would want to buy it, why would that be? So, as we're getting out here and getting taxied forward up to the actual active runway here, we'll start talking about the Cessna 195 once we get airborne. First of all, we just want to do a quick check here, make sure everything is... Do a quick run up here. Take it up to about 1700 RPM. Pull the prop back, make sure that we're actually seeing the RPMs drop. That's good. We'll put the RPMs back to full. Check that we have full and free controls. Now on the Cessna 195, we don't need flaps on takeoff, so we're not going to add any flaps. I think we're just get started. And it's a big radial engine out there. There's a fair bit of torque, and so we are going to need to do a little bit of work with the rudder pedals here as we're taking off. And we're off and climbing out at Saint-Hubert, one of the first landmarks that we're going to take a look at, and it's one that I know well from having visited it in a professional capacity over the years. Is off to the right. We're going to have the Canadian Space Agency, the headquarters of the Canadian Space Agency, here in Saint-Hubert. It's been here for about, it's almost 40 years now. It still looks like a pretty nice new building. It seems to be fairly well modeled, by the way, in Microsoft Flight Simulator, right down to the fact that they've got the little yard out the back that kind of looks like a little bit of construction, but it's not. That little round rectangle you see there is actually the Canadian Space Agency's Mars yard, where they test Mars rover designs. And it's right there in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's actually a pretty impressive building. Nice to see that landmark has been well modeled in World Update 11. So let's talk a little bit about the Cessna 195. So first of all, first category, how does the model feel? Well, first of all, it looks great. The external details, as you can see when you're taxiing there, there's lots of detail in the external texture. There's lots of really interesting detail in the internal model. The cockpit feels like a cockpit from the 1940s or maybe 50s, which is what it's meant to represent. It definitely is not the same as a modern cockpit, and it has lots of interesting details, including even you can see the folds in the fabric around the dashboard there. So from a looks perspective, the model feels great. The other element of sort of how the model feels that's particularly important is the sound model, of course. The sound model in the Cessna 195, like a lot of other Carenado's other local legends aircraft, the sound model is okay. I don't think it's fantastic. I think in general the sounds lack a little bit of bass, a little bit of low-end oomph. I mean, the engine sounds are okay, but they don't really have a lot of those low-end resonances that you'd expect from a radial engine of this size. And on the subject of the engine, the startup doesn't really have a whole lot of character. There's no chugging as it comes up to speed. It warms up very quickly, doesn't generate a lot of smoke or anything when it starts, as you'd expect from a big radial. So, there's not a lot of character there. Similarly, you can hear when you put the flaps down. They have a very nice sound of an electric motor bringing them down. But there's no sound once they're deployed, and the sound doesn't change with speed. Overall, the cockpit sounds really don't change with speed. You can't. The sound model doesn't give you any sense of actually how fast you're going. So the sound model doesn't really deepen the immersion very much. It's not bad, but it's also not great. Doesn't do a lot to add to the feel of the model, which really good sound models do. Now, this may very well be, again, it's a local Legends aircraft. It's only $15 US on the marketplace, and that's probably one of the places where Carenado did not spend the time and effort on this kind of model, and that's fine. So, in general, what's the experience of flying it like? Well, it does definitely have the feel of a golden age of piston-engined aircraft, that's for sure. The steam is full steam gauges, not even any GPS. The engine sounds like you would expect, although as I said, it could be a little bit deeper. It does sit the nose is very high when it sits on the ground. The side window is a nice addition, so you can actually stick your head out as you're trying to steer it. But basically sitting in the cockpit, and particularly I would say sitting in the cockpit in VR, I would rate it fairly highly as a unique feeling aircraft. And I'll point out that it is an aircraft that's particularly good for VR because it doesn't have a glass cockpit. I don't know if you're like me, but my VR setup, one of the real limitations of it is reading text off a screen. And so I find flying glass cockpits actually a little bit of a challenge. Results in a bit of eye strain for me in flying VR. It's not a problem with this aircraft. So it's a particularly good choice if you tend to fly in VR, actually. And the cockpit is interesting because it's not cramped, but it's not particularly roomy, so it feels really interesting in VR. So, how does it feel? It feels about like what you'd expect, and I'd rate it fairly highly. It could be better, but it's pretty good. So, how does it fly? Well, the Cessna 195 flies like a high-wing monoplane tail dragger with a big engine in the front, which is good, because that's what it is. I mean, some of the features that you would expect in this kind of aircraft, honestly, is the ground handling is a bit of a challenge because of how it sits on the ground with the nose so high and blocking your view. And, okay, that must have been an issue for pilots that flew this aircraft. Takeoff and landing requires you to be fairly active on the rudder to maintain directional control, and that, too, is something that I'm sure pilots at the time had to be adept at. And being a tail dragger, landing requires you to make sure you really bleed off airspeed until the very last minute, or you will bounce the touchdown, which I do most of the time. And again, that is what you would expect. Also, being a tail dragger with a high wing means that crosswind landings can get pretty exciting. It does tend to be very susceptible to a crosswind, and it does like to weather vane when you put the wheels on the ground. So that's also something that you have to be aware of. The big engine does have lots of inertia, doesn't respond to the throttle immediately. So you do have to work not to fall behind the power curve. Given that it's got a high wing, it does have a fair bit of adverse yaw, so you do need rudders in the turn at pretty much any speed. It is more responsive, I would say, to rudder to the left than to the right because of the P factor with the engine, which again is also something that you would expect. So, you'll have to remember what airplane you're flying whenever you're flying the Cessna 195. It doesn't fly like a Cessna 172. That's for sure. Okay, maybe it's time we get a bit of a change of scenery here. So we've moved from Montreal out west to Calgary in Alberta, which is another one of the cities that was modeled in World Update 11. So, as I was saying, I think I like the Cessna 195 flight model. I think it's pretty unique to the aircraft. I think you need to pay attention to what you're doing if you want to fly the aircraft well, and that's what I'm looking for when I buy a new aircraft, so that's good. If I had to pick some nits, I would say that it feels a bit pitchy to me. The pitch sensitivity seems to be much higher than the roll sensitivity. Now, that may be typical of this kind of aircraft. I haven't ever flown one in real life, so I can't say for sure. It does seem to be a feature of aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Say the Beech 18 was very similar. And the only thing about it being kind of pitchy is it does make it a little bit difficult to trim. Given that it doesn't have an autopilot, that's a bit of a limitation, because if you do want to fly hands-free, you want to be able to trim it well, and it does take a little bit of work to get it trimmed out. Now, one other thing about the flight model is it does have a pretty good turn of speed. As you can see, we're pretty effortlessly doing between 160 and 180 miles an hour now, which is pretty good for a high-wing monoplane. Now, that being said, it's not really fond of flying slowly, even with flaps down. Slowing down to, say, below 80 means flying pretty nose high, and things get pretty mushy, which makes approach to landing a little bit interesting. But, overall I'd have to say that I would rate the flight model pretty high. because it does feel to me to be pretty authentic. There's lots of things that are fairly unique to this aircraft that make me feel like I'm actually having to learn to fly this aircraft when I fly this aircraft, and that's really what I'm looking for, at least in the flight model. So as far as how does it fly? It flies like what I think it should fly like, and so I would rate it pretty highly in that category. And just a quick sightseeing note, we're coming up here on the left. You can see the Calgary Olympic Park with the ski jump hill and the luge track and the bobsled track. And we did a quick tour of Calgary. I would say, based on knowing a little bit about Calgary, it looks to be pretty well modeled to me in World Update 11. So now we're just going to continue our trip here up the valley of the Bow River and take a look at some of the other landmarks that were modeled in World Update 11. We're going to go take a look at Banff and Lake Louise, and we're going to end the day flying into Golden, British Columbia. So the next category that I want to talk about is, what is it good for? Why would you want to choose this aircraft out of all the others in your hangar? And what kind of flying are you going to do in it? Well, I would say, first of all, if you're working on your basic airmanship, it's actually an interesting choice, especially if you're kind of, upper beginner, intermediate, or beyond. It's not a beginner aircraft. But it is good for practicing tail dragging skills, and it will provide you with a bit of a challenge. Landing the Cessna 195 does require some interesting techniques and some pretty careful management of both speed and power. And it does take a bit of work to stay ahead of the power curve. So it does pay you back for flying it well. So I think it's a good aircraft if you actually want to learn to improve your flying skills. And it's even maybe a good choice if you want to do a bit of kind of lead-in training for flying in warbirds, because it does share some of the characteristics of warbirds in that it has a big radial engine that does take some time to respond. It's got a lot of weight in the front. Now, it's not as twitchy as warbirds are, but it does share some of their handling characteristics, so it's maybe a good choice if you want to do a little bit of practicing before you move up to some of the warbirds in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So, quick sightseeing note here. We're just coming up on the town of Banff. That's Tunnel Mountain there in the foreground. You could see the Banff Springs Hotel. It's hidden by Tunnel Mountain now, but it's in one of the landmarks that's modeled in World Update 11. Hopefully we'll get a look at it as we go by the mountain here. And so what else is the Cessna 195 good for other than training? Well, it certainly is an excellent aircraft if you like to do VFR touring in Microsoft Flight Simulator. For one thing, it has great visibility, not just because it has lots of windows, including over the top of the cockpit, but also because it's a high wing. It means that you can look out and down, and you're not restricted by the wing or the engines at the side of the cockpit. So visibility is as good as any other aircraft you're going to find. The other thing about the Cessna 195 is it will get you where you're going in a fair hurry. And another quick sightseeing note. Now we've skipped ahead a little bit farther up the Bow River Valley, and we're coming past Lake Louise on the left. And again, there is Chateau Lake Louise, which was another landmark that was added in World Update 11. So as I was saying, the Cessna 195 has a pretty good turn of speed. It's not a problem to cruise at 160 miles an hour. Which is quite a bit faster than the Cessna 170 or the 172 kind of grade of aircraft that you might also be doing some VFR flying in. Now, the 195 is not going to be really great for long-distance flying because, as I mentioned, it does not have an autopilot, and it has really pretty limited nav aids overall. Now, because you do have an artificial horizon and a compass, you can fly it in IFR flight conditions, but it would be pretty tough to fly any kind of modern IFR procedures using the 195. So as an aircraft that you're going to go out and fly a lot of IFR routes between widely separated points, I don't think the 195 is going to do it for you for sure. So overall, the 195 is an excellent trainer and it's an excellent touring aircraft. It's probably not what you want if you want to do a lot of IFR flying or sort of study level simulation. Okay, so we're just making a turn here. We're going to skip forward. And we're just coming into our approach to Golden, BC. And this is a little bit of an exciting approach, which is kind of why I wanted to put it in the video. We're going to have to cross this ridge, and the airport is going to be it's almost directly in front of us. So we're going to have to stay to the left over this ridge and then drop very quickly down to the valley floor and turn into the runway. So hold on to your hats a little here. So let's just finish off our last category here that we need to talk about is, what does the 195 compare to? So get you some up close and personal to British Columbia scenery there. So, in other words, what aircraft have you already got in your hangar that might give you that would be similar experience, so you might not feel like you need the 195? Well, the Cessna 170 is similar in look and feel, certainly, although, and it's high wing, and so it's a good touring aircraft, but it's a lot slower, so it doesn't really have the same performance as the 195. The Beech 18 has similar performance and similar look and feel in the cockpit, in that it's a steam gauge aircraft, but it doesn't really fly the same way as the 195 does, and it really doesn't actually have the same visibility out of the cockpit either. Something like the Bonanza V35 has similar performance as a touring aircraft, but it has a slightly more modern cockpit, and of course it's a completely different flight experience because it's a tricycle gear low-wing monoplane. In terms of any of the aircraft in the basic game that would be similar, I guess you could look at the Cessna 208 Caravan. It has fairly similar performance, and again, it being high-wing, it's a good touring aircraft, but of course it has completely different look and feel with a modern cockpit, and again, it's a tricycle gear. So it's if you're just looking for a good touring aircraft, the Caravan will do it for you, but the 195 is really a completely different experience. So the last thing we need to talk about is, do you want to own it? And maybe I'll do that after we finish off our landing here, because I need to focus on the landing, because not only is this a fairly narrow little runway up against the river, and it was an interesting little approach there, we also have a bit of a crosswind. It's not strong, but it is a straight 90-degree crosswind, so I'm going to get a chance to demonstrate for you what I meant when I said when the 195 can be a little bit of a handful on landing, especially in a crosswind. So as you can see here, I'm keeping the speed fairly high. Maybe I should be a little bit slower, but again, if I pull the nose up, it just then I end up flying fairly nose high, and it's harder to see the runway, and also even harder to deal with the crosswind. So we're going to have to make sure when we round out and flare that we hold off a good long while, otherwise we'll bounce all the way down the runway. So we're just still letting the crosswind take us a little bit to the right there. Try and get lined up, try and pull back power, kill a little bit of speed here. Okay, kill the speed. Try to get back to the center line, kill the speed, let it float. Let it float, let it float even more, let it float even more, let it float even more. Takes a while. Okay, well, not a bad landing. Actually, one of my better landings in the 195. Oops. Would be good if I could try and keep it on the runway after we landed, though. There's the weather veining that I was talking about. So I think it proved my point that, landing in the 195, is a skill that has to be learned, and I'm part of the way there. So, final question in the review is, do you want to own the Cessna 195 Businessliner by Carenado? And I guess the answer is that if you're into VFR sightseeing, and particularly if you enjoy the kind of golden age of piston engine feel, I think it's a great choice. I think it's a great choice if you do a lot of flying in VR. It's a cockpit that works very well in VR. And let's face it, at $15, it's pretty good value for money. And I'm actually enjoying it a lot. It's been one of my real go-to choices lately. So let me know what you think of the Cessna 195 in the comments, and let me know what you think of this format of review. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.